Hey young friends, Dr. Bill here. Again, I am so glad that you could join me for today's lesson. I know that all of you are really glad that school is out. And so I hope that you'll have a terrific summer and that when you go back to school in the fall, you'll have a more normal year. Won't be interrupted by all of the stuff with the pandemic, and it won't be time for you to put on masks and wear them all the time. I just hope you have a great summer. Thanks for joining me today. Well, today we're continuing our conversation about big names in the Bible by focusing on a man named Gideon. You'll find his story in the book of Judges. Now you may remember from our last session that the book of Judges tells the story of a lot of different characters, figures who were judges. Now that doesn't mean judge in the legal sense, someone who's wearing a black robe and presiding over a courtroom. No, in the book of Judges, the judges are leaders that God raised up for a specific time and for a particular purpose. Usually when the people of Israel were in trouble, when there was some kind of crisis or threat, that's when a judge would come on the scene to help the people of Israel meet that particular challenge. Well, in the book of Judges, when we come to Gideon, the threat that the Hebrew people faced came from another group of people called the Midianites. Now, they lived some distance away from the Promised Land, but they traveled throughout the Promised Land, and whenever they did, they wreaked havoc on the people of Israel. They would destroy their crops and steal their produce. They would steal their cattle. They would just make life miserable for the Hebrew people. They would take away so much of what the Hebrew people needed to live. As a result, the Hebrew people were terrified of the Midianites. And often when they got word that the Midianites might be coming their way, the Hebrew people would retreat and hide themselves in caves and among the rocks in the mountains, trying to escape from all the danger that the Midianites posed to them. Well, naturally, because of this threat, the Hebrew people called out and said, God, we need your help. We need to be delivered from these terrible people. And so God answered, as God always does, not by just jumping in and fixing the problem from the outside. No, God raised up a leader to help defeat the Midianites. And the person God called to take on that task was a man named Gideon. Here's some points that are important to note from Gideon's story. First, when God recruited Gideon to do this big job, Gideon wasn't so sure he was the right man for the job. And he wasn't really sure that it was God he heard speaking to him. He wasn't sure if God was really calling him to do this work. So at least on 2 occasions, we find that Gideon is a little reluctant, he is a little scared, a little timid, and so he asks God to confirm his call to him by doing some signs. In other words, he's saying, God, if it's really you speaking to me, I need for you to prove it. God, if this is something you really want me to do, I need some way for you to confirm it. So in Gideon's story in the book of Judges, on 2 occasions, Gideon asked God for a sign. And twice, God answered Gideon and gave him the sign he needed so that Gideon would be convinced that God had really called him to do this special task. Now, the important thing about that is that we see from Gideon and how he interacted with God in this way, Gideon was pretty much like we are. We tend to think of our heroes in faith as always being faithful and always being strong and always being sure about what God is doing. Gideon shows us that that's not always the case. Sometimes we have questions. Sometimes we have doubts. And in Gideon's case, he shows us that it's okay to voice those questions and those doubts to God and to ask God to make us sure about what we're doing and about what God is calling us to do. That's the first thing about Gideon. The second is this. When Gideon began to assemble an army to go out and do battle with the Midianites, God wanted to make sure that Gideon knew that it was God's power that would deliver and save the people, that it was God's power that would deliver them. So, when Gideon assembled the army, he initially had 22,000 warriors. And he went to God and said, hey, we've got an army. We're good to go. We're ready to go into battle. And God said, wait just a minute. If you take that many into battle and win, you're liable to think, and the people are liable to think, that your own hand and your own strength delivered you. I need for you to make your army smaller. Now, doesn't that sound crazy? We're going to go out and do battle, and I want you to have a smaller army. Well, Gideon didn't quite understand, but he said, okay. And so he went to all of his warriors and he said, listen, if any of you are really afraid, if you're scared that you're going to die or that something is going to happen to you in battle, just go on home. Leave right now. It's okay. Well, when Gideon made that announcement, a lot of folks went home. So many went home, in fact, that Gideon was left with a force of 10,000 warriors, 10,000 soldiers. So Gideon went back to God and said, hey, look at this. We've got a smaller army, much smaller. How about this? And God said, it's still too big. And so he said, I want you to do a test. Take these people down to the stream, all 10,000 of them, and watch how they drink water. And those that drink by lapping like a dog, you put them to one side. And those that kneel and drink that way, I want you to put them to the other side. And the ones that lapped like a dog, well, there were only 300 of those. And God said, that's my army. Send everybody else home but the 300. Now, I'm sure Gideon was really nervous. He'd gone from an army of 22,000 to 300. Nevertheless, as the book of Judges tells us, God used Gideon and those 300 to rout the Midianites, to defeat them in battle. And so the lesson there is that God wanted to make sure that Gideon knew that it was God's power that had delivered them and not his own strength. A final note about Gideon. After all of this success on the battlefield, after all of this success against the Midianites, naturally Gideon was really popular. And so the people came to him and said, we want you to be our king. We want you to rule over all of us. Well, now that'd be pretty heady stuff, don't you think? I mean, if somehow everybody said, oh, you're the best, you're tops, it'd be hard to turn down an offer like that. But Gideon said no. He understood his role, and he understood that he was not called to be king. He was called instead simply to lead the people at this particular time. Gideon was humble enough that he knew his own place. So let's sum up Gideon and what he has to teach us. First, in all of our dealings with God, it's best to be honest about our questions and our doubts. If we have concerns, talk to them. Talk to God about them. If we're scared or if we're unsure, it's okay to say, God, I'm not so sure you're really in this. I need a way to figure this out. Gideon shows us how important it is to be honest and forthright with God. Secondly, Gideon shows us that there are only some things that God can do. God-sized dreams, God-sized accomplishments, well, they depend on God's power. And sometimes, as Gideon shows us, sometimes God wants us to make sure that we understand it's not our own power, it's not our own capabilities, it's not our own strengths that made something happen. It's what God did that made all the difference. And finally, Gideon knew his place. He knew that his call was to do a certain task at a certain time, nothing more, nothing less. He didn't let his success go to his head and make him proud and make him something he wasn't supposed to be. He remained humble. He had a good handle on who he was. So Gideon has a lot of good things to teach us, and I hope that you'll read his story in the book of Judges. I hope that you'll pay attention to it. And as always, if you have any questions, give me a call. Send me an email, give me a text, whatever. I'll be glad to do whatever I can to try to answer your questions. Well, that does it for today. And until next time, I hope you have a great week, and I wish you all of the very best of God's blessings. Take care. Bye-bye.